Every day, our environment is undergoing changes that impact and affect our world. Global warming, climate change, environmental pollution and degradation, desert encroachment and flooding are daily destroying our world and making it unsafe for habitation. How do we cope with these changes? How do we improve the quality of life through our environment? These and many more environment issues will occupy us weekly on Environment Today.
It's imperative that people comply with laid down environmental laws if we must enjoy the benefits of a clean and healthy environment. But there are certain habits which are outrightly unfriendly to the environment.
Join NKOLI OMHOUDU on Africa Independent Television AIT as we take an incisive and in-depth look at our environment. Environment Today, creating a better and safe environment for the world.
Welcome back. 2 years after the National Tobacco Control Act was signed into law in Nigeria, the modalities and regulations for the implementation of the Act has remained a mirage. In this special report, I traced the processes leading to the passage of the NTC Act, the factors impeding speedy passage of the regulations for the implementation of the Act and the consequences on public health, and of course, the position of anti-tobacco activists on the matter. The National Tobacco Control Act, NTCA, was signed into law in 2015 by the Goodluck Jonathan administration, 10 years after Nigeria ratified the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, a global treaty signed by 187 parties as control measures on tobacco consumption. The Act, among other things, provides for comprehensive prohibition of smoking in public places, restricts tobacco adverts or any public statement that promotes tobacco products, and provides for at least 2 unobscured health warnings covering 50% of total surface area of tobacco packages. 2 years down the line, the modalities and regulations for implementation of the Act remains a mirage.
There was a leak from within the Ministry of Justice. You can imagine when public officials are in bed dealing directly with the tobacco industry and you're trusting the same public officials to accelerate a regulation. It's ironical. It's something that you would not expect. So we need like more commitment from the government.
And I can only state here that all processes as laid out by the National Tobacco Control Act itself were duly followed, were duly observed, and that the industry has just been crying wolf when there is none. And in the first place, that document is supposed to be a secret document of government, which no one has seen. And after our committee finished their job, I don't even know the update on the document. So you begin to wonder whether the industry is conducting espionage on the Nigerian government. And they're doing all this because they don't just want Nigeria to have strong, effective national tobacco control policies.
So it took Nigeria 10 years actually to get the National Tobacco Control Act in place. And that was in 2015, May 26th, it was signed, the act was signed. So since then, implementation has been slow. There hasn't been full implementation of the NTC Act because the Act requires that regulations have to be developed by the Ministry of Health, Federal Ministry of Health, and sent back to the National Assembly for approval before the Act can be fully implemented. Some parts of the Act are being implemented actually. For example, the setting up of the National Tobacco Control Committee. The committee has been set up, is up and running at the moment, but most provisions of that Act, most provisions are not being implemented because the regulations are not ready.
According to data by the American Cancer Society, tobacco use accounts for 87% and 70% of lung cancer deaths in men and women, respectively. World Health Organization's records also show that tobacco consumption currently kills 6 million people annually, a figure which could rise to 7 million deaths annually by 2030 unless parties take drastic policy measures to regulate it. 80% of these deaths are expected to occur in low and middle-income countries, including Nigeria.
It's a killing business. And sometimes there are always questions about choice, your decision. I am a smoker. It is what I want to do with myself. But of course, there are consequences on other people. Secondhand smoke is really terrible. You know, it's responsible for most of these non-communicable diseases. And when you see your loved one dying of cancer, you see your loved one suffering cardiac arrest, and you're wondering, oh, this person doesn't smoke. What wrong did this person do? But sometimes you don't know that this person is surrounded by people that smoke.
We do know that worldwide 690,000 people also die from secondhand smoke. And in Nigeria, we know that up to 18 million of our children are exposed to tobacco smoke in homes. And in public places, up to about 24 million children are exposed to tobacco smoke. And where does this leave us? Our children will not be able to develop both cognitively, because we've linked tobacco to actually low intelligence quotient. Our children will have a lot of infections.
This is why anti-tobacco activists are calling for speedy passage of the NTC Act implementing guidelines.
Government process is slow, and today we are asking them to hasten up. We are asking them to fast-track that process and ensure that the regulation is presented as quickly as possible.
We're aware that the Federal Ministry of Health is working really hard to make sure that those regulations are developed as soon as possible and sent to the National Assembly for approval as soon as possible. It's important for me to mention that in the last 2 years that this act has been in place and it has not been implemented fully. Every single day, young people, our kids are being addicted to tobacco. More and more children are picking up the habits of tobacco smoking, and more Nigerians, especially young people, are being exposed to the effects of secondhand smoke.
A lot has been happening actually after the act was passed into law. I know the Federal Ministry of Health has been working very hard to make sure that the regulations that will make some part of the act that cannot be implemented without a law to be passed and to be sent to the National Assembly, and then for it to be passed by the National Assembly. What we need to do as Nigerians is to urge the Federal Ministry of Health and all the parastatals that are involved in making these regulations to go on to the National Assembly to expedite action on that, and for the National Assembly to fast-track the passage of the regulations.
We are not resting on our oars in the tobacco fight. In pursuance of the provisions of the Act, I inaugurated the National Tobacco Control Committee on 12th July 2016 to advise me on tobacco control matters. In line with our mandate, NATOC produced a draft National Tobacco Control Regulation, which shall soon be transmitted to the National Assembly for approval.
The advocates also want states which are yet to have smoke-free laws to do so fast to save the lives of youths constantly lured into smoking by tobacco companies through all forms of marketing gimmicks portraying smoking as socially acceptable.